Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk Abolition, Pride Edition, a discussion with queer movement leaders. I'm Charles Stevens. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the executive director of the Counter Narrative Project. I'm also a 42-year-old Black man. I would like to thank our program sponsors, the Center for HIV Law and Policy, CNP, Interrupting Criminalization, Reframe Health and Justice, and Positive Women's Network. And special thanks to Team Jami from Jami Linguistics for providing Spanish and English interpretation. Thank you to Brandon Kazin Maddox and Body Language Productions for providing ASL interpreting services. Before we get started, I would like to share some of the topics we'll be discussing this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. We're going to begin by defining some of the terms that we'll be using in our discussion, just to make sure everyone is on the same page. We'll then provide some historical perspective around public health and the history of criminalizing marginalized people. We're going to discuss the stakes of what happens when we internalize policing and punishment. We're going to discuss alternatives to state violence and punishment and police. And we're going to discuss movement building and solidarity work. But before we get started with our discussion, I would like to invite each of my colleagues and panelists, co-panelists, to introduce themselves.
I'll go first. Hey, everybody. I'm Mandisa Moore-O'Neal. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm also the ED over at CHLP, Center for HIV Law and Policy. I'm a dark-skinned, Black, fat femme, and I'm really excited to be in this conversation.
I'll go next. Pardon. I'm Kate. I use she and they pronouns. I am a fair-skinned, mixed Asian and white person with red lipstick and big rainbow earrings, sitting in a very boring office. I am a partner at Reframe Health and Justice. We're a queer person of color collective that works at the intersections of harm reduction, healing justice, and criminal legal re-envisioning and reform. And I'm really honored and excited to be here to have this conversation with all of you, and just want to express my sincere gratitude to everyone who made this possible.
I can go next. My name is Sallie Thomas. I use she, her pronoun, and I am the decrim specialist at Positive Women's Network, which is a national membership body of women, cis and trans, and gender nonconforming folks living with HIV and working to build power for our community. And I'm a light-skinned Black woman, and I'm also in a boring office.
Hey y'all, I'm Andrea Ritchie. I go by she. I'm fine with any pronoun. I am a very light-skinned Black woman with glasses and curly hair in a boring living room with some nice art behind me. I'm co-founder with Mariam Kaba of Interrupting Criminalization. And for folks who want to see all of our faces and not just the signers, you can hit gallery view on your view, and then you will be able to see all of us. And if you want to focus on ASL interpretation, you can keep it in speaker view. And I will pass it back to Charles.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. And I mean, I'm really inspired by just this amazing discussion. But we also thought it would be important and I think really powerful if we also share a bit about how this discussion came about. So Mandisa, would you mind just sharing with folks how you went about bringing us all together and just what inspired this historic conversation?
Yes. Hey, y'all. It's 6 p.m. here in New Orleans. And I started at CHLP as the ED in October. And it's been exciting because I really enjoy the people who I work with. I love the work that we're doing and the ways that we're expanding. And one of the most exciting expansions is that since March, CHLP publicly and internally identifies as an abolitionist organization. And for us, that's been a process and a way of growing and a way of shifting many of our practices. And so one of the ways to grow in the shift is to be in conversation with our people and to share and learn about what this means for us and how it affects our work now and moving forward. And so in one of our staff meetings, Amir, who's our policy and advocacy manager, he actually had this suggestion, like to have another conversation on abolition and to locate it in Pride Month, because Pride Month is one of those moments in which it's really been co-opted. And so it was a chance for queer movement leaders, a very small segment of us, to talk about our work ourselves as opposed to people talking on our behalf and often missing the mark. And so we're like, let's do it. And we were like, who should we ask? And we were like, our people, and folks said yes. And we're grateful.
Thank you for that. And Charles speaking, thank you for that context. Speaking of context, we are here certainly to unpack and grapple with and imagine and dream around abolition, particularly in this context of June and so forth. And as we're, grappling with and discussing abolition, I wonder if it might be important to just begin to unpack what we mean when we talk about abolition. I know, Mandisa, we've had even some discussions around just sort of unpacking just how we, what we mean when we say abolition or abolitionism. And I was wondering if folks on the panel, if somebody would like to just kind of break down what we mean when we talk about abolition, or how they define it. And so I'm just going to open the floor.
I guess I would start by defining abolition as a world without policing, surveillance, punishment, or exile of any kind. And in the context of this month, particularly without policing based not only on race, but gender, sexuality, gender identity, and expression, and certainly other markers of oppression, disability, nation state, class, etc. And I think that it's not just a politic, it's a practice. I think often we say we're abolitionists, but then we do things that are not. And so it makes sense. We're all swimming in this ocean of carcerality, and we're taught policing from the moment we kind of were taught to be in relationship with other people. And so it's a practice. It's a politic, it's a practice, and it's a vision for an entirely different world in which we all have everything we need to survive and thrive. So that's a definition.
Thank you so much for that. Charles speaking again. Would someone else like to weigh in?
Yeah, Mandisa speaking. I remember the first time I learned the word abolition outside of the history I was taught as far as like the abolition of child enslavement in the 19th century. First, it was the first time I heard the word as a contemporary movement and not a historical one. I was like, oh, I thought that ended in 1865. What are folks talking about in well, just whatever, I'll tell my age, in 2006. So for me, it was first like an intrigue of like, oh, that's a word that people use to describe themselves in this moment. And then when I learned more, and it was folks like Andrea, like who were and still are teachers, at first, like, it was my understanding it was about what like I learned as a prison industrial complex. And then from that, I was like, okay, it isn't just about cages, which no cages, and it's about policing, or like what often leads people into cages. And now I understand all of that is a part of abolition. And also it's about abolishing a system and conditions that say prisons and cages and punitive responses is the way to deal with violence and harm. And that understanding made it very clear for me as an abolitionist and as somebody who now leads an abolitionist organization, that the same degree like to which I'm tearing stuff down, I have to actually more build it right back up, or build something more just up. So the understanding has grown to one where it's not just about you critique, you tear down, you dismantle. What are the tools? What are the ways of imagining safety instead? And so that understanding has been very freeing, quite frankly.
And I love that you frame it that way, and just building off of what has been shared, just thinking about certainly abolition as a not just being a politics, but as a practice, as Andrea pointed out. I was wondering, and this came up in our planning, thinking about actually de-internalizing the prison industrial complex as a way of being. And I've also been sort of grappling with carcerality as a consciousness, right? And I was wondering if somebody would like to share about, well, what does it really mean? And Mandisa, I know you were kind of getting at that. What does it really mean to de-internalize ourselves, de-internalize the prison industrial complex as a way of being, like really ridding our consciousness of it?
I think while Mandisa is thinking about that, one of the things I often say is like that we need to divest not just financially or politically, but ideologically and emotionally from the prison industrial complex and from policing, and from the idea that it produces anything but violence, and certainly that it produces safety. So I was just buying you time to answer, Mandisa.
It's Mandisa. I was actually not going to answer that one. Sorry.
Awesome. I think just for the sake of, again, setting a foundation for this discussion, one of the terms, or two of the terms that I've seen come up a lot in our movement work has been restorative justice and transformative justice. And I was wondering if someone could share about, like, well, what do we mean when we say restorative justice, and what do we mean when we say transformative justice, and how are they different?
This is Kate. I'm happy to hop in there, and really also want to credit the amazing folks that have built such a scaffolding to the point where transformative justice is a part of our vocabulary, and restorative justice and acknowledging those differences. So people like Shira Hassan, Andrea, people like Miriam Kava, where restorative justice is really, it's just about focusing on the person who experienced harm and offering the kind of support and repair that that is focused on healing and is focused on coming back from that experience. And it is not necessarily competition, or it's not mutually exclusive to transformative justice. I really see them as two pieces of a much bigger conversation, where transformative justice is about looking at the conditions and at the circumstances that had that person in a situation where they felt as if causing harm was the only option or was a valid option. And we see this all the time when we look at these experiences of harm. They're always so much more complex than we think they are. And so on one hand, it's simply focusing on the person who experienced harm and saying, how can we come together to support, to reinforce, and to foster your healing? And transformative justice is about saying, as long as these circumstances exist, these experiences of harm will continue. And so as much as we can talk about the situation as some kind of standalone siloed moment, we can also look at it as a product of circumstances and context that we can change. And I also want to put in community accountability as kind of a third practice, where which feels kind of like the third piece of that pie, where it is about that person being accountable to the harm that they created and possibly participating in that person's healing, but making sure that they understand what has happened and reflect on the circumstances that made that possible, and hopefully commit to moving forward in a way where harm is less of a product of whatever circumstance was created for them. I also just want to name that is my understanding and recognition of those three, and that those are such social and ingrained experiences that I am very excited to hear the spaces where that definition kind of differs with the other panelists.
I'm going to jump in. Something that I think about is kind of going back to the previous question about like de-internalizing. I think for me, when I first started to get into like abolition, something that I thought about was like, how am I actually like practicing this in my real life and in my actual relationships? Am I treating the people that I interact with every day in a way that's punitive? And why am I doing that? And why does it feel good to punish people who've harmed us? And I think when we're able to understand that, like on like a very personal level, it's we're more able to like help ourselves do this work in a way that's impactful. And I would say in terms of like transformative justice, this made me think of an interview that Derica Purnell did with Trevor Noah. And she gave this analogy of like a roof leaking and buckets. So like the roof is leaking and you put the bucket down to help catch the water. And then now the bucket's overflowing and there's mess everywhere. And someone says, hey, like, let's get rid of these buckets. But then someone else says, well, why would we get rid of the buckets? The house is going to flood. It's going to smell like mold and mildew in here. Like, we can't get rid of the buckets. But what we're saying is, yes, we are going to get rid of the buckets, right? That's abolition, like getting rid of it. But we're also going to fix the roof, you know? So when people hear like abolition, they're saying, oh, we can't get rid of police. How could we do this thing? And it's like, well, we're not just saying like, we're going to take the bucket away, for example, and let the house flood. We're saying you actually have to fix the roof first. Like that's where you actually get to the core of actually fixing the problems that are existing rather than using policing to create a Band-Aid for problems that are going to persist.
Thank you for saying that, Sallie. Something that I think about is the discomfort like that I experience talking with people about this. And it's so quickly tied to how we think of safety. And for Black people, for Black queer people, for Black women, you know, trans and cis, safety is integral, you know, because it is the narratives and experiences of being unsafe since we were trafficked on this land that in many ways is not the extent of our experience, but is a part of our experience in terms of like, our wombs were capital that birthed this empire. That is an inherently unsafe social location to occupy in this empire. And what is really painful is, so I'm in New Orleans. It's one of the quote unquote most dangerous cities in the country. So it's often a conversation about law enforcement and calling the cops. And a question like that I have with my neighbors is, we've seen the investment of our city budget in NOPD, in the sheriff's office, in the state troopers, in the levy police, because the levies need a cop apparently. Can you honestly say that you're safer? We've seen the rise of, like it's often called petty crime, or like quote unquote smaller things, right? So for me, the question is, if that hasn't brought you the safety that you were promised, why can't we try something else? So that's something that, because to me, it'd be one thing if folks could say, oh, well, the budget has increased by 5 million in 2 years. And I can tell you that when I open my door, I feel safer in these concrete ways. But it's the opposite, like often. And that's not just in New Orleans. I know that that is the experience in the US. So it's often a question for me of, what literally do we have to lose here? I'm telling you that I believe in a grounded assessment, we have a lot of things to gain.
Awesome. I just had a very strange power outage. That's where white supremacy will not stop. You got to stay vigilant all the time. It was testing me, but we made it through. And this is Charles speaking. I think there are many things that bring us together, and there are many joys I share with doing this work with all of you. But I know one of our movement intersections is through public health, and particularly around HIV decriminalization movement work. And I was wondering if someone would like to share about any historical perspectives around public health and its history around criminalizing marginalized people, like how those intersections manifest, or really just any insights you would like to share about the complicity of public health in the carceral system.
This is Andrea speaking. I would really point people to the work of Healing Justice Lineages that has created a timeline that tracks this from many centuries before now. And that really highlights the ways in which public health, like many institutions of the carceral state, was set up to other and criminalize, which is a political process. It's not about criminal laws. It's about naming certain groups of people as threats inherently. So it kind of doesn't matter what the criminal laws are. The same people will be criminalized, and criminalization is more than just being, policed and beaten and harmed and killed and shot and put in cages and exiled. It's also being denied basic needs and basic humanity, and being made more vulnerable to all forms of violence by people beyond the state. And that has consistently been the case for disabled people in the US since the moment before it became the US, and an ongoing basis. And the public health system has been a way of implementing that. It's also been the case for migrants who were not British or French, and even sometimes at the beginning French people and Spanish people. People become white in various degrees over time, but for non-Anglo-Saxon people, public health has been literally at the border policing bodies And certainly the way the French actually got policed around public health was around sexuality. There was an assumption that there was just gayness in French, men specifically. And so there was this way in which they were policed around the assumption that they were bringing homosexuality and every other disease to the US. So I think that happens over time. Who gets criminalized as a body changes over time, but the mechanism is the same. And so I think many folks, for instance, might have heard of Typhoid Mary. Well, she was an indentured person who contracted typhoid and was incarcerated for decades until her death. So that's been sort of a way that, contagion has been named and controlled in very classed and raced and sexualized ways throughout history. And then certainly we all know, hopefully, some of the more recent experiments, the Tuskegee and other, the ways in which public health has been used to justify all manner of violences against Black people, against Indigenous peoples, against people in the sex trades, against people living with HIV most recently, and then also in the context of COVID policing. And so during the pandemic, along with Erica Purnell, I co-founded the COVID-19 Policing Project, which tracked criminalization of the same people, as one would expect, through public health orders that showed that the group that was most likely to experience enforcement of public health orders when mask mandates and quarantines were in place were Black women, which is also the group most likely to be killed by police when they're unarmed, also the group most likely to experience policing in the family policing system, in the health policing system, in every policing system. So it was very telling that that's how public health played out. And so I sometimes am concerned when people are saying public health, not policing, or we need a public health approach to public safety. I'm like, yes, we need to look at what are called the social determinants of health, which are also called anti-capitalism, and have that be what we're focused on, those conditions that Kate was referencing that create multiple violences, but we can't do it through an institution that is also reproducing carcerality in its function.
I also want to add on to what Andrea said, and name that I think one of the most pervasive lies of the criminal legal system, of these punitive interventions, is that if you are victimized, if you are identified as a victim, that you are in some way benefiting, you are in some way safe, and you are in some way restored through this process. And for me, my background is organizing with folks in the sex trades primarily, and I point to the history of the way that public health has approached the sex trade as a way of kind of understanding that there is the experience of victimization, there is the experience of harm. The way that the concept of a victim, this anonymous person, is used in policy and law is really as an excuse for the state to intervene. And it doesn't matter if you're seen as a criminal, it doesn't matter if you're seen as a victim, you're really an excuse for state power in under these systems. And for sex workers, like, the expansion of public health has always been an experience of criminalization, but through this idea that you not necessarily were a criminal in the same way, because those terms are always so gendered. But you were rounded up, you were probably not even put through the system, but there was a history since about the 40s up into the mid 70s, where it was actually Department of Defense funding that went into rounding up people who were profiled as sex workers or loose women and forcibly detained, forcibly tested, forcibly treated with all sorts of STI, very nascent, very experimental procedures and medications. And just because someone is seen as a body to protect, that still means a body to control, and it still, in these cases, means a body to forcibly experiment on. And So I think that I wanted to contribute to kind of round out the public health sentiment that, you know, now when we see things like diversion courts or problem solving courts, where they say, oh, you're in the system, but we understand that you're not a criminal, you're a victim. What people are really meaning is you still need to be controlled. Thank you. It means that you still need to be under the control of the state in a way that might be a little friendlier on paper, but still is a form of punishment, of sanction, of stigma, of shaming, and ultimately of deep dehumanization. And the money came from the Defense Department because it was concentrated in areas around military facilities, because they thought that they could make the perfect soldier. So it's also very deeply rooted in the idea of eugenics when we are looking at these bodies as diseased.
Mandisa?
Oh, take the hand down, sorry. I remember the first time that I learned like the history of public health. And it's one of those words like that up until then, I just took as like, oh, this is good. Like the public should be healthy, like public safety, the public should be safe. Like these are things that, you know, I'm for. How could I not be? I care about people. And then understanding that like many of like the first origins of like the institution, the like complex of the public health infrastructure, I was actually tied to robber barons wanting a workforce healthy enough just to work in the factories. Like it was never about wellness or health as we talk about it in our people, because like when we talk about it, it's not about being healthy enough to fucking work and expend labor for someone else. It's about taking care of our people. It's about building things like that, like grows us wellness. And that really helped to shift my perspective and to understand exactly what Andrea and Kate said, as far as we have to imagine more than just social workers as the folks who are somehow better, as if there is a group of us who have not internalized policing. So I remember, I think it was 2020, that social worker had reported that teenage girl in the Midwest working in legal aid, having to talk down social workers from calling the cops on their clients, trying to prosecute them under HIV criminal statutes. These are not one-off stories or rare instances like the media will have you think, oh, it's just that social worker. No, it's the industry. And so I often think about, you know, in the work that we're doing, how common it is that public health departments share health information, personal health information with law enforcement, and how it's normative. And it's seen as absurd that we're questioning that as a practice. And so for me, it's been a helpful framework, like the same ways to be clear that it's a reason why public safety, that multi-billion-dollar industry, you know, and public health have those two words in common. It's a way to, once again, lie and deceive people as to what the actual interests are. And the interests have never been our collective safety, because we're clear what actually makes us safe. And it's not the carceral system. We're clear what actually grows wellness and what actually grows not so much health, but healing. And it's not the carceral system. And something else like that Andrea said that reminds me of conversations we've had in CHLP, you know, as far as oftentimes how people talk about HIV in particular, especially HIV criminalization, as if it's like, okay, well, folks are criminalized because of their race and their gender and their HIV status, as if it's a separate group of people. So again, it's assuming some sort of default race when we talk about HIV. And it's like, no, it's the same people. It's like you can't talk about criminalization and not have a deep understanding of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. I don't care if it's a criminalization of abortion, if it's a criminalization of the right to protest. No criminalization as constructed in the US is not going to deeply impact Black people. And that's not always in the conversations that we have. And so I appreciate Andrea and Kate, and Sallie for making it clear it's the same folks who are being targeted. And health conditions, like stigmatized health conditions, have been an arena to additionally target our people. So maybe folks didn't get arrested under the drug laws, didn't get arrested under sexual criminalization. Okay, well, this is definitely going to get them. So it's a way to fuck with the same people. And I'll talk more about our dichotomies, and it's a question in the chat about MHS strategies I'd love to respond to, but there's some things that I believe we can do different to respond to that.
I find that one of the more sinister ways that the carceral state works is not just imposing itself from the outside onto marginalized communities, but can perhaps be wielded sometimes within marginalized communities against each other. So in other words, there's this notion of harm and this notion that a perception that the only way to respond to harm is through the carceral state, is through the intervention of the state. And I was wondering if we could just kind of unpack that a little bit. What is the relationship between harm and punishment and accountability? And I know we're going to get probably a little bit deeper into alternative models of punishment, but I wanted to start sort of because I think harm also kind of came up in this conversation. And I think in public health, it especially comes up where if someone is harmed, then they're seeking, I don't know, perhaps vengeance that they call justice through the carceral state. And I was wondering if we could kind of unpack punishment versus accountability as a remedy for harm.
This is Andrea. Punishment involves enforced suffering, involves violence of some kind, involves it's something that doesn't actually change the conditions in any way. So an example, for instance, is, if we believe in punishment for sexual violence because we're against sexual violence, and that punishment involves sending someone to prison, we're just replicating sexual violence in a different place against a different person. And that doesn't end sexual violence, right? It just moves it behind a prison wall, and maybe exposes more people to sexual violence than were exposed before. So I think, but that doesn't mean that abolitionists don't think there should be consequences. In fact, the consequences that we imagine involve actually changing conditions, of saying, if you are harming someone and you will not step in to take accountability for that harm, which includes stopping the harm and repairing the harm, then there's going to be a consequence that maybe you don't get to be in a position where you can do harm again, right? So we may need you to be no longer in a particular space, no longer hold particular positions of power, no longer have the weapons or whatever it was that you used to do the harm. And I mean, I think that's where I would see the difference. I think the line gets blurry, and often people talk about something as a consequence, but the motivation behind the consequence that they're seeking is desire to see someone suffer. And I think that's where the abolition as a practice and a practice of disinvestment from policing and punishment ideologically, emotionally, spiritually, in every way, is hard work. Because, you know, there's not, I can think of 10 things right now I would like to see someone severely punished for, and that was with like a millisecond of thought. And so obviously I have to be in a practice of imagining what would transform the conditions that produce the harm that I'm concerned about, rather than venting all my rage about it on one person or group of people.
Thank you for saying that. This is Mandisa. Speaking of practice, I like the practice of saying my name before I talk, before I off mute. Thank you for saying that, Andrea. My experience is people use the language of transformative justice and of accountability and mean punishment, and is one thing. And also, and this seems especially relevant given that it is Pride Month, and just like histories and legacies of anti-queer violence, that is also such a part of our stories. Again, not our full stories. You know, is this idea that some things are justified, you know, like, well, it's not ideal, but this is what we have now. So since this is what we have now, I think it's acceptable to support this punitive response. And that's an area that like we are continuing to reckon with, you know, in terms of how often, like, which to me, my whole point saying that was, how do we have a conversation about this whole paradigm of victim and perpetrators? You know, like, how often have Black women, trans and cis, who have experienced a direct form of interpersonal violence and seek the help that we're taught we're supposed to seek, are then the ones who are further criminalized, because victimhood and white, cis, middle-class woman, able-bodied, is the norm of what a victim is, and will never be that, meet that, attain to that. And so to me, like, that's also tied in the conversation of, let's be clear about this framework that you're using and advocating for over here, and also being clear how many times in a day is it then used against us. And we can't pick and choose what portions of this rotten fruit we would like to eat. Like, we can't actually say, oh, well, this little piece right here looks less rotten, so I'll ingest that. You know, it's the whole fruit. And so that's something else like that I see, like, us try again and again to do. And again, it's painful. I'm not saying it's an easy process. I'm not saying it's a comfortable process. I'm also not sure what about freedom is supposed to be comfortable.
There are some really amazing questions in the chat and comments. Just want to affirm that. And why don't we start pulling some in? So I see one question. Is there a future in which we can take control of the resources the state keeps hostage from us and give them to our communities to be well, divest, invest, and how do we get there? And this is Charles speaking. Is there a future in which we can take control of the resources the state keeps hostage from us and give them to our communities to be well?
This is Andrea. I mean, you're building that future right now. We're all building it together, hopefully, even through this conversation. I think the resource that Amir dropped in the chat early on around abolition in the state that interrupting criminalization created was part of an effort to start a conversation. It doesn't have answers because we don't have answers, and not all abolitionists agree on how we relate to the state. I think we all definitely see the carceral racial capitalist state as a problem, and how we extract resources from that to projects of building safety in community is one that we're currently all engaged in. I do think that there's this constant effort to declare movements to divest from policing and death-making institutions and invest resources into communities. People keep trying to say that effort is dead or has failed, and I don't know why because I guess if something actually is dead, you don't have to say it every 5 minutes. It's self-evident that it is, but there seems to be this effort to keep trying to claim that those of us who are trying to build that world, and that world that is being fought for, can't exist. But I think the organizing people are doing, and conversations like these are proving that it's exists in our longings and in our imaginations to the extent that we're able to ask those questions, and then we just need to keep moving in the directions they point us to.
This is Kate speaking. I love this question. I also believe we are moving towards it. And actually my initial pause was even just in the framing of the question of, should we be thinking about taking control of the state's resources, or should we be thinking about how to maintain those resources within our communities? What is the role of the state? And what do we want collective space to do to provide for us? I think those are all questions that have to be answered, and probably are going to be answered in 1,000 different ways. And so I would say I feel like, at least for me, I think the greatest thing that we can do right now is learn to listen to each other better, and learn to have hard conversations about what incremental change looks like. Because I think we can get together on our shared values, on something that feels like a shared view of liberation that is cohesive enough to make us want to move together. And I think one of the biggest challenges right now is that incremental change conversations are hard. And no one actually knows the right answer. We're all trying to make our best guesses. And we're all learning along the way, including learning about our own oversights, our own gaps in knowledge, our own learning curves, those little triggery pieces inside of us that get activated when we're hurt and when we're scared and when we're afraid that we're going to be left behind again by people who it would be so painful to be left behind by. And so I feel like the greatest thing that we can do right now is learn how to step out of our own issues. I mean, I did it myself. I was like, I know sex work as the example of this. And we do that all the time. We think about our issues and how they're the ones that get left off of the big bills that get introduced into Congress. And I think coming together around the shared value of collective liberation and recognizing and getting better at holding each other in a space that is messy and complex, and where we all accept that we wish we knew the clear next step and we really don't, and how to have that conversation is, I think, the greatest thing that we can do right now to invest in that collective and shared movement.
I think this has been somewhat of a thread throughout the discussion, but could we just, I think, unpack a bit more? And I'm flagging Stephen's question. How do we begin to de-internalize? Better yet, how do we put together a way to assist others, groups, communities, and industries to de-internalize? And this is Charles speaking.
Mandisa speaking. So again, that's a process. And the first step is we have to acknowledge that it's real. You know, oftentimes like folks like, you know, want to see a problem and skip to how to solve it and how to make it better. And talking about criminalization, talking about abolition, talking about fuck white supremacy, patriarchy, it mandates us like to acknowledge that we've internalized it, and that it doesn't have to, like, oftentimes when we talk about race or gender, it's like you're a bad person if you've internalized white supremacy. And surely I don't like white supremacists as like an identity, alt-right people. And I was born in the US. So this idea that somehow I have not internalized what literally has existed since like even before I was born is wild. And you don't stop there. Like you acknowledge, ooh, even with like the best of my intentions, I was raised to be anti-Black by some pro-Black people. So acknowledging that, it then gives me a framework, a lens of seeing the world, of questioning, is it really that I prefer this person? Is it really that I think that this person might be better in the position? How did I decide that? What are the qualifications? I'm saying this as a leader, you know, of an organization. What qualifications have I then internalized that talk about professionalism or quote unquote better qualified, all of those things? And so being able to be in a not once a day, like not once a week, I'm done, in a regular practice of acknowledging I've internalized, that's when, for me, I was able to unlearn, is acknowledging that I had learned it. And acknowledging that in this process of unlearning, it's going to be some ways in which I don't do it so well. And acknowledging that, like being able to like be super real and not like sugarcoat things, and also dwell and be like, oh, okay, I can see how this time I did this so much better than last time. And oh my gosh, here's some ways where, ooh, I can really stand to be in a particular place of improvement. And what are the tools? Who are the people I can be, again, in regular practice with to improve on this? How can we engage in accountability of things that we have identified, you know, we want to grow and learn on? And much like how I think of restorative justice, it's not really a moment in which it's done. You repair until it is repaired. That could take a month. It could take 10 years. It really depends on the scope of what it is I'm trying to repair. So, you know, like that for me is helpful as far as like as the unlearning. And then also, you know, pushing folks around us. You know, I think of Harriet Tubman because whenever we talk about freedom, she's somebody who I often go to. You know, I think of how Harriet left her husband, you know, and then came back for him, you know, and thinking about like that process, thinking about how she came back for her blood family. So thinking about, you know, what does it mean to not just be in this process for myself, because that's fun, but how do I talk about these things in a way where my family chosen, you know, for me or blood or however that looks is also in that process.
Yeah, I really appreciate that particular perspective because it builds on one of the questions in our chat. And I know this is something that many of us have talked about, just really around, well, in part around, you know, as we're fighting the good fight and struggling against incarceration, and it seems like it's coming from all fronts, just about the sustainability piece of that. And so the question is, what can we do to continue the work of abolition as queer folks when we receive many doubled violence coming from the state and our cishet counterparts. And as folks are thinking, sort of pondering that very big question, because I think that's one of those things. And, I mean, I'll say for me, one of the things I believe in is admitting and talking about struggles, talking about the areas that I haven't quite figured it out, talking about, I'll say in the community that I'm a part of, most of us don't leave this work whole and healthy always. Many of us have to leave for our own survival because it does feel like you're fighting the system, and then you're fighting your cishet counterparts, and then especially those of us that are in intersectional that occupy intersectional identities. But I would just be very curious about just kind of like how you perhaps as in your own practice sort of grapple with, like, what does it mean to be fighting mass incarceration, the carceral state and the system, and these other forces of oppression and structural violence in your life?
I can jump in. This reminds me of like the need to like rest, because the work is hard. It's not getting easier, unfortunately. And when you exist in these intersections and you're actually also doing the work, it could feel like very overwhelming. It could feel like you're defeated. So I think that something that I practice is like looking at my peers for genuine allyship. Like, I don't want you to just say, like, I'm down with you. I'm down with Black folks. I'm down with queer folks. I'm down with trans folks. Like, actually do the work and commit and get some skin in the game. Take a risk using your privilege to ensure that folks who are marginalized have an opportunity to be pulled up. And it's not up to us to continuously fight. I think that we should prioritize rest. We should be able to put things down and have trust and faith that someone is going to be able to pick up the baton and keep running. So for me, I think we can continue to do the work, but we do have to really ensure that the folks that are coming along this ride with us to abolition are genuine allies, not performative allies, because that's the only way that we'll be able to all genuinely come together to create the change that we wish to see.
This is Kate, and I love that answer, and I love that question. And I apologize, my answer is kind of forming in my head, and so based on my experience. And I think a part of this question is a question on what we expect from spaces and where we are investing because we are wanting to make change, and where we are investing because we want to serve our hearts. And I know that for me has been basically a big question of not being a 25-year-old organizer who doesn't sleep, and coming into a space where, changing the organizations that I was working for, recognizing the way that they were engaged in white supremacist practices, engaged in exploitation of folks with different identities, folks with lived experience. I ended up actually just questioning how much I could expect from spaces that were so rooted in the same systems that were creating the conditions and the circumstances of harm. And having a very realistic conversation with myself about what I anticipated from those spaces was deeply painful. But it also came with the realization that I had entered organizing to heal my trauma, and prioritizing that meant that I was going to demand something from a space that wasn't possible. And finding that the more that I invest in the creation of queer-centered spaces, of queer BIPOC spaces, and that happens in community and in chosen family, And in these little localized backyard barbecues in the middle of Baltimore in the summer is the space where practicing liberation became something different, and it became something so much more generative than I could have ever anticipated doing policy analysis. And honestly, I feel like I have learned the relationship to wanting to say, like, this is the rule because I said it, and finding how often, like, once you're around a couple 4-year-olds, all of a sudden your relationship to directives and punishment and how much easier it is to be authoritarian than it is to listen to someone, especially when they have trouble articulating their needs. And 4-year-olds are not good at articulating their needs at all. And in those spaces of community and chosen family, and especially with people who are decades older and decades younger, I think for me, that gave perspective in a way that I did not have around the nonprofit system and everything that we were dealing with.
There's a really brilliant question, another really brilliant, many brilliant questions. This chat is amazing. I'm just like loving the chat. Can you talk, ooh, can you talk about respectability politics? Charles speaking. Can you talk about respectability politics? It feels hard to even bridge conversations around harm reduction in some communities of color because of deep-seated feelings people have about the moral argument. Ooh, Mandisa, want to take that?
It's Mandisa. Sorry, I put the hand down. See, been 3 years. I should know how to use Zoom by now. Oh, longer. So if you're having a conversation on criminalization, on abolition, I so appreciate that that is connected to the conversation of respectability. For me, I find it challenging to approach a conversation of respectability and start with people of color and not start with white supremacy, since that's actually where the politics of respectability originate, right? So this idea that it constructed this idea that you are only valuable if you fit this certain mode, right? So you can't be a whore, you can't look like a whore, you can't sound like one. I can't look like a criminal, but then that's confusing, because if criminality and Blackness are so linked as defined by white supremacy, I can't be Black? Yes, that's exactly the point of respectability. And so what's challenging then as a Black Southerner is the ways within which we've internalized that respectability as the way that keeps us safe. Like, once I understood that the people who taught me the most about patriarchy and respectability were actually trying to keep me safe in the tools that they thought would do that. I mean, I still was sad and angry and had lots of feelings, and it gave me a much broader context of what was happening, So it happens like when folks, when a cop kills a Black person and suddenly everyone knows that person's like a really good student in 10th grade, as if any of that matters, or like all these facts, And so for me, a conversation about communities of color, it's helpful to remember at its root is white supremacy, and that anybody can and does internalize white supremacy, and how that then plays out. I also see it play out in terms of how we talk about criminalization. Like, I see this all the time. I mean, in many, but I'll just talk about the HIV, world, where this whole focus on undetectable status, we don't want to say it, but that's also a form of respectability, because it's assuming that only people who are compliant with medication and only folks who do the right things. Although, side note, there are people who are compliant and still will never be undetectable, but we'll keep that aside for now, assuming that undetectability was only about, taking medication every day, which it's not. Why would we craft policies around something that from the get-go isn't attainable for everyone? Why have we even conceded that we abolish HIV criminalization by focusing on personal behavior and not systemic failures? And so I just think about all of that in a conversation about, respectability. And as a Black feminist, how respectability historically has been and still is a tool to especially target and oppress Black women and folks socialized as Black women and girls, ways of keeping us in line, of our value and dignity is often tied to it. And then how do we then play it out? I know in sex work conversations, I'm just thinking of, it's so many people who, in order to not be in jail or to not be in the system in some way, have had to say, I was trafficked. And how that then is a form of respectability in terms of, okay, it's we can engage, understand and be okay with it if I was a victim and I was trafficked and all of that. And, it's just so many examples. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Does respectability politics influence who we fight for as a movement?
Yeah. I would say it does in the work that we see, in terms of we start the conversation with who's more palatable in their eyes. We center whiteness in our entire we start with whiteness. We start with who's palatable, who's going to look good for them. And unfortunately, when we start centering something other than our experience, other than my authentic self, it falls apart, because at the get-go, it was always about winning them over. It was always about what's going to work for them. Although historically, the construction of whiteness means you will never attain to this. White people can tell you that. They have not been offered the full scope of what whiteness is supposed to bring you. So we're never going to attain to it.
I just wanted to jump into name respectability politics as another, sorry, this is Andrea speaking, to name respectability politics as a form of criminalization. I think that's something that we just don't often think about, the ways in which we enact criminalization. It's a way of saying, you're not worthy of our respect, of our care, of your story being told, that there's something inherently flawed with you, that's inherently threatening about you to our collectivity or community. And I think for queer and trans people, there's so much about that. There's so much of that in our own communities, in Black communities, in migrant communities, in so many communities where it's, just don't be, why you gotta tell people that, why you gotta, be so flagrant with that, why are you dressing like that? Why are you acting like that? Why are you performing that? Why are you out in pride being that way? And it's a way of sort of I think you're very right, Mandisa. It's a way of embracing and enacting what we've been taught and the structures of oppression that we've internalized. But I just wanted to name that that is a kind of criminalization. It's a crime. It's a kind of othering that we engage in. So the question earlier about how do we de-invest, how do we start practicing the world we want and not the world we're in, is really challenging that and seeing that when it's operating in ourselves, when we're like, oh, you know, maybe I should wear something different or not be so loud, or, you know, maybe I don't need to proudly declare myself a dyke every room I walk into. You know, it's a challenge to do that and be like, no, that's how we're disrupting criminalization as a process. We're refusing it. We're saying we're going to be all of what we are at all times and hold none back and celebrate all of it, and invite our communities to do the same as a resistance to the ways in which we are policing our own gender, sexuality, and racialized ways, and our own bodies in racialized ways. I think also there's a politics of respectability around fat phobia, around body, around disability, certainly, for sure, and that all of these things come into play when we're thinking about resisting criminalization in all its forms.
I think the only thing that I would want to add, oh, sorry, this is Kate speaking. And I think that the way Mandisa and Andrea have discussed it is so powerful. And I think the only thing I would want to put with that is, especially for non-Black folks of color, I think really doing the healing to understand the way that racialization happens and the way that things like model minority status are entirely part of anti-Blackness, that they are rooted in anti-Blackness, that the demand of that role, of that specific racialization, is to participate in white supremacy. And that all of us really need to do the unique racial healing of understanding why and how we are pitted against each other, and the purpose of that and who did that is so deeply important to recognizing our role. Because until we recognize our role in white supremacy, it makes it so much harder to disentangle and to specifically unlearn and heal from, and recognize the ways that you were forced into that participation in a way that is unique and is specific and is purposeful.
And I see we're sort of moving into this, one of the questions that we discussed talking about on this webinar, which is about movement building and solidarity work. And I was wondering if folks would like to weigh in a bit about, what does solidarity work mean? What does movement building? How do we build stronger movements, particularly with perhaps the broader abolitionist movement, or perhaps other movements? Like, how do we have more solidarity, essentially?
This is Andrea. I wanted to maybe jump in with an example in response to a question that was posed earlier, also about how do we invite different sectors to disinvest from criminalization. And one of the initiatives that we have at Interrupting Criminalization is the Beyond Do No Harm network. Amir dropped the link in the chat before, but I just did again. And the way that network is organized, it's organized around a shared experience of criminalization when seeking care. And that experience is shared certainly by HIV-affected people, and is the whole reason for being for the Center of HIV Law and Policy, right? And Zero Project and other groups. It's also experienced by people in the sex trade. It's also experienced by disabled people, by migrants, by queer and trans people, and especially now trans people seeking gender affirming care, by abortion seekers, by pregnant people, by parenting people, and by drug users. And so that's a pretty broad array of people and movements. There are many people who live at the intersections of all of those identities, but not everyone does. And not everyone experiences criminalization when seeking healthcare in the same ways, or to the same degree. And obviously, you know, the more you live at the more intersections of oppression you live at, the more that's going to happen and the more ways it's going to happen. But starting from that shared experience in all of its nuances and complexities enabled us to come up with ways to invite healthcare providers into disinvesting from their role in policing and surveillance and punishment and exile, and to reinvest in their role, their commitment to provide care, and their number one commitment, which is to do no harm, and to help them understand criminalization as harm, and to then measure everything they do in relation to that. And so that's a way of inviting kind of a whole sector of people into a conversation about what divesting from criminalization and investing in care looks like from a multi-sector, cross-movement approach. And I think to the question earlier that Sallie was answering too, around how do we navigate being in solidarity with people who are harmful to us, it's also a practice space for us to say, yeah, I get that you're fighting criminalization through pregnancy. I'm gonna need you to get next to me to fight criminalization through access to gender affirming care, because guess what? It's the same thing. It's the same laws they're using, the same medications, the same doctor, all of it is the same. So I'm gonna need you to get beside me and check your transphobia and your foolishness, because they're coming for both of us. And I think that's one way to kind of create practice spaces for us to navigate these things.
Sallie?
Thanks, Andrea. This is like a shameless plug for the Health Not Prisons Collective. So I think like what you're saying, Andrea, is like we have to like look at like all of the ways and all the spaces that criminalization happens. And I think what the Health Not Prisons Collective is doing is looking within ourselves and pooling our own resources and gathering our different skill sets and unique experiences to come together as a collective, which I can explain to y'all is just like a collective of 5 partner organizations: the Counter Narrative Project, Positive Women's Network, the Zero Project, Transgender Law Center, and the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus. These are all groups who have been longtime collaborators, and they've been led by and accountable to the same communities. So in coming together, I think that there's power in saying like, y'all focus on this and y'all do this well. We focus on this and we do this well. Why don't we all come together if we're all like working toward the same goal? We don't have to work in silos. We can all come together in an effort to actually be able to influence things that we couldn't if we were working by ourselves.
I think I want to throw out one final question before we start to wrap up. It's Charles speaking, by the way. As a narrative strategist, I'm always very interested in the power of narratives and how they shape public policy and really shape people's lives in reality. And I feel like one of the narratives that I've seen perpetuated, particularly in the media, but also in other areas of culture, is around that communities of colors and marginalized communities are really pro law enforcement, that defund the police didn't work because people of color, Black folks, essentially rejected it, that they valued safety as administered by the carceral state over perhaps alternatives and so forth and so forth and so on. And so I was wondering if anyone had any insights about how we as abolitionists can incorporate or integrate a narrative strategy in our work. Like, what is the narrative strategy that we need in our movement? If folks have any insights about that.
Charles, you just hit play on a rant I have been going on. So I will try and keep it brief because I want to hear what my compas think. But I think, and I'm not speaking of the narrative or counter narrative project here, but I think the focus, well, first of all, the notion that Black folks don't support defund is bullshit. Like, it's what people were saying earlier. If you give people one number to call and nothing else, then you say, oh, by the way, I'm gonna take that away too. People are gonna say, nah, but we know it's Russian roulette and it doesn't give us what we need, but it's the only thing. And if you ask Black folks, and there's tons of polls to show this, if they want investments in their communities that are not police, 100% for, right? Like, it's the alignment with the demands of defund is much higher in Black communities because Black communities are experiencing the harms of funding the police more seriously. But the rant is actually around this notion that we lost the quote unquote narrative, and that there's some magical incantation of words that if we just say it right, Massa will give us what. No, it's not going to work like that. It's that we actually is a very powerful narrative that we created because we demanded exactly what we wanted. It was very clear that we demanded what we wanted. And it's so powerful, they're still talking about it in the State of the Union address, in every time they speak, in their fundraising letters, in their op-ed pieces. They keep trying to say it's dead. So it's obviously powerful. But it's powerful not because someone in a communications shop came up with a good narrative. It's powerful because it comes from organizing. And so I think it can be very disorganizing to focus solely on narrative, as if people's lives are changed by reading and views are changed by reading a well-written Washington Post editorial, or seeing just the right amount of words on a billboard in the right order, right? People's views of the world are changed in relationship. And so, yes, the narrative change, the understanding, the sense making of the world changes through telling different stories, but those stories need to be told in relationship and in the context of changing material conditions. And I think it's actually disorganizing to have a focus exclusively on quote unquote narrative and not have a focus on building the relationships and power that will enable our story of the world to be the one that we organize people to and bring into being. So that was hopefully the shortest version of the rant.
This is Kate. I love that answer. And what this made me think of was that, so in Baltimore, during COVID, our state's attorney, which is our version of a district attorney, stopped prosecuting something like, I think, 23 different low-level misdemeanors. And after the decision to do that, and then a period of time after that, went around and did community meetings to talk to people about their concerns. And so I was at some of those meetings specifically to talk about why arresting folks in the sex trade was a bad idea. And we got the same question over and over and over again in relationship to that, which was some form of, sometimes I see someone and I want to help and I don't know what to do. And so I call 911 because I think I'm seeing a victim of violence, because I see someone in the sex trade and I've been told they're a trafficking victim. And I don't know what else to do, but I've been told to call 911 to, if nothing else, I'll get that person help and I'll start building a case against their victimizer. And so if you're taking away the police, tell me what to do. And every single one of those conversations was powerful. It was meaningful. It was a beautiful moment of connection. If you read Fox News, at every single one of those meetings, someone would stand up and say, we need to keep arresting people in the sex trade to save them. And therefore, this imaginary monolithic audience, who were all people of color, support cops and don't support non-arrest. And if you only read Fox News, that's the narrative. And if I took anything away from that, it's that the most important space I could have been in is in community with those folks. having those conversations and recognizing what utter bullshit that was. And so I absolutely think that the way we do this is so much more granular and so much more about fractals. Because if you don't know those community members, if you believe that narrative, it means that we have to invest in learning each other a lot more, because that's not what folks were saying.
Awesome. Thank you for those responses, and thank you for all of the brilliant insights in the chat. Amir, dare I put you on the spot, or someone, if folks have questions or comments, or if something bubbles up later on this evening and you'd like to sort of like ask another question, Amir, would you mind being the person that people can send their like questions to if they didn't get answered, or if they feel like they have some follow-up? I just want to make sure that we're able to like hear from get everyone's input as much as possible. But with that, could we just, if folks on the panel, if y'all would just like to, any final thoughts, reflections that you'd like to share before we say goodbye?
Yes, because I'm corny. This is one conversation. Hopefully it has seeded more conversations, and based on the chat, I think it has. This is Mandisa. And that's what it's about. Like, I think my process of unlearning has also been being clear, like that so much of what I've been told is through a particular lens, including how I think of freedom. So in my mind, it's this like big thing, it's grand, it's a lot of like, it's like an event. And then like, we're free. And understanding, like for me, and it's what I believe, is that it's a journey. And these conversations is such a huge part of it, and asking questions and being willing to say, I don't know, like, I don't know actually what I would do. I need to think about that. I need to like be in a process of thought as far as how to move forward, and also doing something and then assessing, ooh, if this happens again, I'll make sure to reach out to this person first and then get the information or XYZ. And so I'm just grateful for this conversation. And what it means for our collective imagination.
I can add, thanks, Mandisa. Something that stood out to me throughout this entire conversation is like how hard this work is, even to get started unlearning the things that you've been brought up to know. And something I appreciate that Andrea said was that this is a learning space, like we have to be able to meet people where they are. And so if you feel like you're new to abolition, like that doesn't mean like you have to sit in the background and figure things out. Like allow yourself to work through it, because the folks who are leading, the folks who are on this call right now, still haven't figured it all out. We're still a work in progress. There are still times where we feel like we want to be punitive towards others. There are times where we don't have the answers and we're still grappling with what a just society looks like. We don't know. So I feel like it's, as long as you hold on to the fact that there's room for mistakes. There's always going to be mistakes, and just like stay steadfast in the fight, you'll be fine. And something else that stood out to me when you were talking, Mandisa, was how you said like around respectability politics, how it's oftentimes you'll put like a palatable person at the forefront of something to make it easier for everyone else, well, white folks to digest. And something I would say is like, don't focus on being a palatable person. for those in the audience, that is not your goal. Like, you want to be loud, you want to be Black, you want to be queer, you want to be a whore, whatever you want to be that. And don't ever feel like you need to put yourself in a box in order to create the change. And lastly, just like in terms of sustainability, I think as a personal thing and a movement thing, we have to just make sure that we're prioritizing ourselves, taking care of ourselves and taking care of our people. So check in with your folks. It's important, and I don't think we could get this work done if we don't do that.
Andrea, Kate, did y'all want to give any final thoughts? No pressure. Okay. Well, I'm so grateful for this discussion. Thank you, audience, for holding space with us and weighing in and asking these amazing questions and giving feedback. And this is Charles speaking, sorry. And thank you, panelists. I am just, again, grateful to be in struggle and community with you. So grateful. With our panelists, finally, if you would like to, maybe if you haven't, maybe put your social media, email in the chat, no pressure. And I guess we could probably also send that out with the recording, so folks can know how to reach folks if they have other questions. But with that, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Again, I'm Charles Stevens, and it's been an honor to hold space. And I guess, as Mandisa said, stay tuned. I'm sure we're gonna continue these conversations in some capacity and build together. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.